So I'm Dan Freed, Director of the Center of Mathematical Sciences and Applications here at Harvard, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the fourth installment of the YIP lectures in mathematics, physics, physiology, and psychology. So thanks to the YIP family for endowing this lecture series, and I'll turn it over to HT, who will introduce the speaker.
Well, thanks a lot. I'm very happy that Professor Josh Tenenbaum agreed to give this lecture. He's a professor of computational cognitive science at MIT, and he undergraduated in physics from Yale University in 1993, and his PhD is at MIT in 1999. He's now the head of computational cognitive science lab at MIT, and also this MIT's project on Quest for Intelligence. Now, Professor Tenenbaum is well known for his fundamental contribution to the mathematical psychology and Bayesian cognitive science. So he received many awards and recognitions. I will only mention some of them. And the first one is his Bayesian program learning research was selected as one of Scientific America's 10 world-changing ideas of 2016. And the second one was in 2018, this Research and Development magazine named Josh Tenenbaum as their Innovator of the Year. And finally, he received MacArthur Prize in 2019, and for his pioneer work to develop and apply probabilistic and statistical modeling to the study of human learning, reasoning, and perception. So let's welcome Professor Tenenbaum.
All right, thank you. Can you hear me okay in the room and up there? Okay, great. It's a pleasure to be here and an honor. Thank you all for coming. So I'm going to be talking about how to build a mind from a brain. As you maybe could gather, if you don't already know what I do and how I do it, if you might have gathered from the introduction, the research that I do lives between multiple fields. I identify primarily as a cognitive scientist, but I also work in neuroscience and artificial intelligence. Our goal is to try to understand most fundamentally how intelligence arises in the human mind and brain. But we do that in what we sometimes call reverse engineering. So we want models, theories, but theories expressed as computational models that take the form of engineering. They have math, but they're also really engineering style models. And so that's what we mean by understanding, at least in terms of our science here. And that also has a payoff, potentially, maybe world-changing, maybe or maybe not, but we'll see, for building artificial intelligence systems which are intelligent in more human-like ways and might live in a more valuable, productive, safe, and just overall positive way in the human world, the worlds that we humans have built. I'm going to talk about some of the work we've been doing here, and I just want to acknowledge at the beginning a number of collaborators. The ones who are in bold are the ones whose work plays some particular prominent role. The ones who are really in bold, the students Leo or Lionel Wong, Gabriel Grand, Alex Lev, and Tyler Brooke Wilson contributed in a big way to the material and the vision of this talk, and even many of the slides. So I want to particularly highlight them. Now, I think to all of us who work in this field or who even just are adjacent, it's an especially exciting time, really a thrilling time, and sometimes a scary time to be working at the intersection of these fields, right? AI is everywhere. The field is old, but it just in the last year or two, it's on everybody's front of the conversation. On the science side, with advances in neuroscience and cognitive science, we are starting to be able to study intelligence across many different kinds of brains. And it's fascinating to us to ask, what is in common? What is it about brains in general that defines intelligence? And of course, we see differences across species, and we see something clearly distinctive and unique about human intelligence. Humans are special. There's a reason why we're here. You know, we as neuroscientists and cognitive scientists, we study many other animals. We study mice, flies, zebrafish, birds, macaque monkeys, chimps. But there's a reason why we're here in this room. And the mice and the flies are out in the fields or maybe hiding in the corners, and the chimps are somewhere sadly going extinct. So I'd like to understand what is unique and special about human intelligence in computational terms. And on the AI side, many of us are wondering, with all the rapid progress in AI, where is it going? Will there come a time when AI is not only just chatting with us, but actually asking these same questions, maybe together with us or on its own? If on its own, what are we? Are we the mice or the chimps? So there's a lot on our minds. Okay. One way of thinking about how you get to human intelligence from maybe simpler, more basic kinds of brains. I want to start with that thesis. It's not the one, it's the one that in some sense, I think most of the public conversation is about. But within cognitive science, I think it's pretty well acknowledged that there's a different picture, and that's the one that I'm going to focus on in this talk. But let me start with this. So one idea is to think about what we can abstract away from a single neuron. Okay, this is from one of the classic papers of Hubel and Wiesel on studying cells in cortex, in primary visual cortex. And the idea that there's some basic computational element, a kind of inner product of inputs and weights, and then a nonlinearity, and then a learning element, like some kind of learning rule, way of adjusting the weights of the neuron in response to minimize some cost function, some objective function. That's a very basic idea, and it's a very powerful one. When you scale it up to very large and deep neural networks, this is the famous AlexNet deep convolutional neural network, and train it on very large data sets like Fei-Fei Li and company's ImageNet, you can do amazing things. Computer vision experienced the deep learning revolution more than 10 years ago when sufficiently deep and big networks were trained on sufficiently big data sets like ImageNet. And then with variations on these architectures, such as the transformer, and training that now on all the text that you can find on the internet, effectively all the language that humans have produced and made public. Basically in human history, you have things like this. And I don't even have to tell you what that symbol represents because it's everywhere. It's probably on many of your phones and laptops, right? But I will mention it. ChatGPT is the thing that made AI, daily on the New York Times and all of our news feeds. Okay? And it's clearly changing the world in many ways. So much so that many people are asking, well, maybe either this is the route or a route to actually finally having machines that are true general forms of AI. Certainly, ChatGPT and similar kinds of large language models present to the general public the way AI was always supposed to present to us, as computers that can do basically anything that computers can do, but that you talk to, you ask them to do something for you rather than having to program them, right? That's every science fiction movie. That's what AI is, right? Whether it's C-3PO or the computer on Star Trek or any number of other examples. I won't mention HAL, except I guess I just mentioned HAL. Okay, so we have AI now presenting itself the way it was always supposed to. And these are systems which clearly are general in that they can do many different things. And so many people are asking, is this both on the AI side, is this where thinking is going to come from if we're actually going to have true human-like AGI? Or many people are also speculating, maybe this is what happened in actual biology, right? That just with enough scale of bigger and bigger brains, which certainly has happened over evolution, like our brains are the biggest, okay? Chimps, basically the next biggest. Having a big brain is helpful, okay? Is it just about scale and is that enough? Okay. Well, again, as I think we're all familiar with, I'm not going to give a whole lecture on ChatGPT, but just to give one example of a phenomena that I think we're all familiar with if we're paying any attention to these systems. They do remarkable kinds of things that look like, and in some sense are, kinds of thinking, and yet they're also remarkably fragile. So to cite one example, this is an example that was on Twitter from my MIT colleague, former MIT colleague, now Stanford, Erik Brynjolfsson, something that was spooky to him, asking a kind of intuitive physics example. And as you'll see later on in the talk, this is one of the areas I like to work on in cognitive science. So Erik asks ChatGPT How would you make a stable stack from a book, 4 tennis balls, a nail, a wine glass, a wad of chewed gum, and 5 uncooked spaghetti sticks? Crazy idea. You can start answering it for yourself. Here's ChatGPT's answer, a systematic recipe. Well, first you start off by placing the 4 tennis balls on a flat surface in a square arrangement, with each ball being a corner of the square. Then you place the book on top of the tennis balls, ensuring that each corner of the book is resting on a tennis ball. This will create a stable base with the book acting as a platform, and it goes on and on and on. It's amazing, right? I mean, if you can look at particular cases here, and it really appears to have, and in some sense, I would say, has some kind of understanding of the physical world, objects, and what is likely to happen in certain configurations and what can be done with them. We can keep going, and this is an example from Tyler Brooke Wilson, one of the students I mentioned, a recent graduate of MIT philosophy, now at NYU as a postdoctoral fellow. So Tyler asked ChatGPT to create a series of block stacking challenges kind of like that. And you can see it comes up with things like the office supply skyscraper, the garden variety tower, the artist's ascent, and then ask ChatGPT to solve them. But if you actually, and it basically it's creative. It can come up with, it can sort of remix the ideas in all sorts of interesting ways. It gets the genre from that one example and whatever else it's been trained on. But if you actually look at the solutions, this is where you now start to see some of the puzzling things, some of the ways its intelligence is fragile. So just zooming in on any one, and they're all kind of like this. The artist's ascent. So the problem of the artist's ascent, I don't know if anybody else can read it. Using a paintbrush, a small canvas no larger than 8 by 10 inches, a tube of acrylic paint, a palette, a cup of water, construct a tower at least 12 inches tall. The structure must stand on its own for at least 45 seconds. Okay, so how do you solve that? Well, open the paint tube and use some paint to adhere the brush to the canvas, creating a base. Stand the palette vertically against the brush. Balance the cup of water on the palette, using the remaining paint as an adhesive if necessary. I mean, it kind of sounds good. It's very fluent English, and it's exploiting various actual physical properties and affordances of these objects. But if you think of it as a stable stack to be able to do this, it's completely crazy. And by the way, when he prompted ChatGPT, he and following other things I did, made it very clear in the prompt to say, it's okay if you can't solve the problem. It's be uncertain or say you can't solve the problem. It's better to be uncertain or say you can't solve it than to give a solution which isn't going to work. But that doesn't stop ChatGPT from very creatively proposing many solutions which just are not going to work. So what's going on here? I mean, these and many other phenomena that many people have written about should make us really be asking, what is the relation between language and thought? A question that many people, including just saw Steve walk in, many people in this room have written really insightful things on that question, especially at Harvard over the years. And from a computational point of view, if we think about a cognitive architecture for language, what are the relation and the roles of language and thinking in that architecture? So that's effectively what we are trying to work on in this research program. Okay. Implicit in the idea that ChatGPT or a large language model that has some emergent thinking properties is this sort of picture. And in some sense, this is an old idea, going back to Shannon, the founder of information theory and the first statistical models of language. The idea that the task of predicting language, saying like what will be the next word or character, or the next sequence of characters or words, is in some sense kind of intelligence complete, that whether it's AI or cognition, that thinking effectively can be operationalized as whatever latent predictive structure is there in between the text that's come before and the text that's come after. Okay. Now, there are some kinds of tasks like the ones here where you can see you have to use various kinds of common sense knowledge or knowledge about the world to complete the pattern. Okay? But there's also a pretty clear pattern evident in the surface form of the language. And so it might seem sort of plausible that just being able to predict the future of any sentence in context based on the first part of the sentence or the sentences that have come before could be a way to deploy and maybe to train a generally intelligent architecture. But then when you take any particular computational system, like any particular transformer, which is a finite architecture trained on a finite data set, even very, very big, okay, that's doing especially the way a large language model works, or any sort of predictive sequence model, that's doing autoregressive prediction, so predicting the next element, token or word, based on all the others, and then just repeating that going forward. There's no particular reason that should be able to solve any problem or perform any kind of thinking, even if there's a lot of interesting knowledge and understanding stored in the latent structure. So here are some examples of problems for which there's a clear answer, okay, and you can compute it, but it's unlikely that a autoregressive language model is going to compute it. Now, there are ways that people in the AI community have been sort of trying to extend these models, like what's sometimes called chain of thought or tree of thought. If you basically train the model to think step by step, which means to generate out not the immediate answer, so not just to fill in the blank, like to that question, but to basically generate intermediate steps of computation, then that can help. It turns out that, you know, again, these are moving targets, but that helps for the top problem. It doesn't help for the bottom problem. But this is one of the things that the large language model AI community is trying to do in order to get the language models to become more general thinking systems. There are other things that are really, really important in ChatGPT and other such models, so-called reinforcement learning from human feedback. So tuning them to be predictive not only of the next token in language, but of the kind of thing that people tend to give thumbs up to as opposed to thumbs down. Okay. So what vision this expresses as a scaling path to intelligence, again, is one that puts language at the center and says, all the patterns in language, that is enough. And from an architectural point of view, says that like language is the substrate of thought. Okay. Again, as Steve Pinker and many others, I think, have written about, there's real problems with that. And I'm not going to go into this, but just refer you, for example, to some of Steve's writing on that, like The Stuff of Thought, great classic book to get some introduction to that. Okay. Let me give a few other cognitive and neuroscience perspectives, though. So, for example, in the work of my colleague at MIT, Ev Fedorenko, she and many others, but these are a couple of slides I borrowed from Ev, she has studied the language network in the human brain using fMRI and other kinds of neuroimaging, as well as other neural recording from humans and other neuropsychology and just behavioral methods to understand a system that, again, people have studied for much more than 100 years with different methods, but a network of brain regions shown here in one of Ev's slides that is distinctively involved in using language. That includes both speaking, like I'm doing, and understanding, like I hope you're doing, also reading and writing, and it doesn't matter. You can be blind and learn Braille. Language is language. Okay. Language is language regardless of what language you grow up speaking, even if you learn to speak one of these constructed languages, like an artificially made up language like Klingon or Dothraki from Game of Thrones. If you're a fluent speaker, your language network, as Ev and colleagues showed, is activating in just basically the same way. The large language models, these predictive transformers, this is some work I played a small role in with Martin Schrimpf and Ev and other colleagues. Large language models act like, this is actually a smallish language model by today's standard, a GPT-2 model, can provide a reasonably good, or at least state-of-the-art, quantitative predictive model of responses in the language areas of the human brain during language processing tasks. So that's interesting. I think I'm not trying to argue that language models don't tell us something about language. But as Ev, along with colleagues Kyle Mahawald and Anya Ivanova, a bunch of us wrote a piece which is coming out soon in Trends in Cognitive Science, sort of trying to articulate this modern computational and cognitive neuroscience perspective on the relation between language and thought. So I'd refer you to that piece also for a lot of really, really good perspectives on this. And that team played a role in this was one of the early studies applying large language models, or now we call them small language models. These models are actually plausibly something a little bit more like the training data these models have is a little bit closer to the training data that a person might get. And they're not bad, and at least they're our best quantitative predictive models of responses in the human brain, and much better than simpler kinds of language models. Okay. But these models, if you remember GPT-2, nobody thought that GPT-2 was a general model of intelligence. Okay. It started to capture a lot of syntax and some of the syntax semantics interface. So pretty interesting stuff. But it certainly didn't capture general intelligence, and it also didn't capture all of semantics even. Okay. But as Ev and colleagues have also shown, right, the language network, the part that's actually modeled by a small to medium-sized neural language model, is really just about language. So when people are doing other tasks, including things that are similar to language in some ways, like solving algebraic equations or understanding code, other kinds of logical reasoning, the language network is not involved in those if you know how to look carefully. And similarly, brain damage can selectively impair just language and not other forms of, let's say, symbolic thinking. So bottom line, language and thought are different in the brain. But an even, I think, a more compelling perspective comes from looking developmentally. So how do children grow into intelligence? I mean, AI people, going back to Alan Turing, certainly in my own AI research, we've been very much inspired by thinking about how children grow into intelligence. And as you know, if you think about it, in the same way that human intelligence is unique, human beings as learning machines are unique. A human child is the only learning machine in the known universe that reliably grows into full human intelligence, starting from much less. So let's look at how they learn to think and how they learn language, right? As, again, to cite another distinguished Harvard colleague, Elizabeth Spelke, also in psychology, this is her book recently published. She and many others in the field of infant cognition have laid out all the ways in which human babies, well before they've learned language, already have systems for thinking about physical objects, systems for thinking about other agents, their goals and plans, and how they interact with the physical world and each other, for example. Okay. So clearly, developmentally, thinking comes first. And that is crucial, we understand as a field, or we believe as, you know, this is somewhere between a belief and a pretty well-supported set of facts, but there's still debate, that the knowledge that humans have prior to learning language is a key part of how we're able to learn language from so much less data than one of these large language models, okay? The latest models might be trained on 1 trillion words, but a human child might hear, people estimate, maybe 5 million words a year. So maybe something like 100 million words over the first 20 years, okay? That's a very, very small corpus by today's AI standards. Okay. Maybe most interestingly in development is the work of Susan Golden Meadow. And I find every time I talk about her work, find this incredibly inspiring. Susan and her colleagues and students have for a long time studied home sign, as well as a related phenomena like the Nicaraguan Sign Language. Home sign is a phenomenon where children who grow up deaf, where they don't get sign language inputs, so they basically don't get language input, they still reliably construct their own communication systems that are kind of like proto-languages. They aren't languages, but they're systems of expressing their thoughts, trying to, and indeed communicating with the other people around them, that have many of the kinds of features of language. So, you know, this suggests that there's something about the human mind that is the creator of language. It's not the other way around. It's not training on lots of language. Language comes from the mind. And even in one individual human is able to start to create their own language if they don't get language input. The Nicaraguan sign is an example of a famous case where an orphanage that brought together home signers, children who grew up without really any standard natural language input, brought them together in an orphanage, and they each had their different home signs, but they kind of figured out ways to communicate with each other, making what some characterize as pidgin and then creoles, basically creating a whole new language from scratch in just a couple of generations. So again, this is just remarkable when you want to think, to me, when you want to think about the relation between language and thought, that an individual human being with no language input starts to find symbolic ways to express their thoughts. And you put a few of those folks together, and in basically no time, with very little data and experience in the grand scheme of things compared to all of human culture that produced the internet, they create their own whole new language, and cultures then start to evolve around it. So that's, you know, telling us something. And again, maybe most strikingly is not just to think developmentally, but evolutionarily. So organisms like the fly or the zebrafish that have only 100,000 neurons, or the honeybee has about 1 million, the mouse, some tens of millions, other traditionally smart animals like great apes or crows, tool users, right? None of them have language. All of them think in some form. Nobody's going to disagree that chimps or crows solving tool use, physical problem solving are in some ways, of course, they're thinking. The zebrafishes, I have a special fondness for due to some work that I was a very small collaborator in work in Florian Engert's lab here, also at Harvard, that was led by Andrew Bolton. But Florian and others have long studied the zebrafish and what you can get from its brain, as well as in this case, in the project that Andrew looked at, behavior. Andrew did 3D psychophysics, looking at how a zebrafish hunts its prey. So if you don't know about zebrafish, the larval zebrafish are really, really small. You need a microscope to study them. And they hunt things which are even smaller, single-celled organisms, paramecia. Okay. The paramecia kind of move in a semi-random way, but not completely random. And the zebrafish try to track them. And what Andrew and colleagues showed is that the zebrafish has a kind of predictive model of the paramecia. It's, in a sense, able to make guesses about where the zebrafish, or where the paramecium is going, and bets about how to get there. Its guesses, the way you know this is that it moves in a very discrete set of actions. It rotates. It's kind of like a video game controller for those of you who play video games. It has little flippers or fins that it can flap and a tail that it wiggles. So it basically moves in a series of somewhat discrete motions of going forward in bouts and turning. Okay, and it will reliably track and pursue a paramecium, but crucially, it doesn't move to where the paramecium is, but it moves towards where it can predict under an optimal-ish, simple but optimal statistical predictor of where it's headed. So it moves towards where it's headed. And if it continues moving towards where it was headed, then the zebrafish catches it. If it deviates a little bit, the zebrafish might give up and go somewhere else. That's the basic psychophysics that Andrew and others studied. So you can see here that in a brain with basically almost no learning and just 100,000 neurons, you already see the beginnings of what we think of as intelligence, which then scales up in all sorts of ways with our much bigger brains and our much more distinctively human, smarter brains. So like the chimps, like the crows, we are consummate physical problem solvers. Whether it's this 1-year-old doing something, solving a problem that probably he never saw demonstrated for him, stacking up cups, not just in the usual ways that kids have been known to stack up cups, but in this case, stacking up cups on the back of a cat. It's as if he's decided that his goal is to see, you know, like a medieval monk, how many cups can he get on the back of a cat? He figures out it's about 4, and then he switches to an easier goal, which is, let me get the cups to the other side of the cat. Okay. My favorite part of the video is what you just saw when he reached back for the purple cup, a very striking form of object permanence in this 1-year-old, because he hadn't seen or touched that cup for at least a minute, if not a lot longer. When kids get older, they do more complex things, as we are familiar with, such as this kid here making a big tower out of Legos, or in a very nice example of physical problem solving that my colleague Kelsey Allen now works at DeepMind. I'll show you some of her work in a little bit. She'll be starting as a faculty member at University of British Columbia in Vancouver next year. This is an example of a kind of thing that she studied, where this kid here is in an Easter egg hunt. You might see the Easter egg in the upper left, and he can't reach it, but he decided, oh, maybe he can use that shovel to reach it. Probably not a use of the shovel he ever saw demonstrated, but he just figured it out. Of course, when it sees it's not working, he switches modes, and now he grabs the other end of the handle, or the other end of the shovel as a handle, and maybe this will work. What do you think? Well, he didn't have time to figure it out because his sister came along, and, you know, ultimately, yeah, it's okay. He did okay. Yeah, but so these kids are cute and sweet, at least some of them, but all of them remarkably intelligent. Okay, so this kind of common sense understanding of and ability to act intelligently and plan in the physical world, something we inherit, but from evolution, but you can see probably distinctively developed in human through both biological and cultural evolution. And then, if we want to talk about the human way of scaling, when language comes into the picture, when kids are old enough to learn both spoken language and then especially to read, that's the real singularity, right? This is the sense in which language models are really capturing, you know, language models in AI are really capturing something important about the human scaling route to intelligence. Human intelligence is or the singular achievement is the knowledge that culture builds socially and then collectively across generations that we can tap into through written language and other enduring forms like that, as well as oral traditions, and then contribute to. Why do we come to universities? Why have we built universities? We're all here for basically this purpose. Okay, there's a reason why lecturing or conversation seminars and writing papers and reading papers, why that is the activity that we have come to understand is a singularly good way of sharing and building knowledge together. But we get to that building on all the stuff you've seen. So what we're trying to understand in our field is how do we capture these ideas in computational terms? And it starts, I would say, and again, I'm reflecting my own view, but also the consensus of a lot of people in computation and cognitive science, as well as in other areas of AI that you don't hear as much about in the news, for understandable reasons, but you should hear more about them. So the way we understand it, I would say, this is a somewhat opinionated, but I think also factually grounded view, is that the fundamental thing about brains that scales up in humans, that language builds on and further scales, is not about learning. Okay, human brains are remarkable learning machines, but the kinds of intelligence you see in much simpler brains is there even before language and even before significant learning. The fundamental computational function of brains is to make good guesses and good bets, and to do that with some kind of model of the world. Like even that zebrafish has a simple model of the world. It's simple, and it's much more constrained than the models that you and I have, or that the chimp or the crow have. Okay, much less flexible also. But this idea that what brains do is effectively build a model of the world at multiple grains and scales of abstraction and generality, and use those to figure out what's there, to make sense of their sense data in terms of the world and themselves in it. And for many animals, they're other agents, either conspecifics or predators or prey. And then to use those models to make good bets about how to spend your time, either your energy and your other resources, what to do next or what to think about next. This equation here has been proposed. It's based on a slide by Max Kleiman-Weiner, from inspiration from Peter Norvig, who together with Stuart Russell wrote what is probably the canonical book on AI. It's called AI, A Modern Approach, which is a slightly weird name because the book was first written in the mid-90s, and the word modern keeps getting redefined, as we all know. I'm just curious, raise your hand if you have read or at least cracked open this book. Okay. If you're here and you have any interest in AI, you all should go pick this book up. There's many editions. Most recent edition came out just a couple of years ago. The reason I recommend and point you to this book is because it's amazing how much of the current conversation around AI is going on, and it's really just about ChatGPT and related like large language models, and leaves out so much of the basis of the field. And many people, especially students coming into the field these days, can successfully and productively do things that we call AI without actually studying most of the basis of the field. But what you see when you get there is a set of tools that, again, have developed over a number of decades that are sort of expressed in this fundamental equation. It's basically, in some sense, it goes back to the classical idea of rationality that you might be familiar with in economics or any other study of sort of rational decision-making. Okay? But the idea of an agent, a rational agent that chooses actions to maximize their expected utility, that goes back hundreds of years as a way to formalize one thing we might mean by rationality. And what the field of AI, as well as computational cognitive science, has done is try to characterize the different aspects of the mind, different components, different representations and algorithms, in terms of basically how they cash this idea out. Okay. And then I think we can think about, and it's exciting, that modern language models and other technologies also let us see where language might come into the picture. So if we have brains that fundamentally evolved to do this kind of thing, and then language comes into the picture, we learn language by basically translating or relating it into those representations for rational inference and decision-making, but then also massively amplify and extend them, because language enables new kinds of world modeling, new kinds of inference and planning that we weren't able to really conceive of without language. So that's, I would say, the roadmap in high-level terms that we and many others, I think, have been working on. Now, you might ask, okay, well, how close are we on this, or how far are we on this roadmap? Is it anywhere even close to what we've seen with the sort of large scale-up neural compute? Well, clearly we're not there yet, because otherwise you'd be reading about that instead of ChatGPT. And to some extent, why this approach, I think, isn't more broadly known is because the people who've been pursuing it have actually made quite a lot of progress, even though there's quite a long ways to go. But we've written up a lot of papers, and unless you read the literature, it's hard to get at that. So one thing that we've been trying to do to remedy this with a couple of colleagues, Tom Griffiths and Nick Chater especially, but many others who've contributed chapters to this forthcoming book. That date is just the date of a LaTeX file that I compiled. So the book will be coming out later this year. And it's a really, well, if I do say so myself, I think it's a really nice book. I can partly say that because while I helped to conceive of this book and did a bunch of work on it, Tom Griffiths really led the charge, and along with Nick Chater and also with me and many others who contributed chapters on many topics, really trying to convey in a way that's accessible. It's more of like a textbook or somewhere between a textbook and a research monograph. So it's not a popular book, but it's one that anyone here certainly could read to try to get a sense of how this toolkit for, let's call it, rational inference and decision-making for what is in some sense maximal expected utility thinking can be used to understand and really reverse engineer so many aspects of human cognition. I'll just show you a little bit about a couple of these things and then come back to language. Because again, though I started with language and everybody's talking about language models and language is the human singularity, it's language building on the common sense representations that are much older that is really the heart of this approach. So two ideas that we and others have developed here for thinking about, well, in particular, these topics of basically intuitive physics and related ideas in causal reasoning and intuitive psychology. So one is this idea which we sometimes sum up as the game engine in your head. And it's this idea that some of the same kinds of tools that have been developed by the video game industry that many of you might be familiar with either because you play games or because you program games that kind of fall under the heading of game engine, that these might be actually a way to think in engineering terms about what Liz Spelke calls core knowledge, or what are the representations and algorithms, the programs that are built into our brain and shared maybe with many other animals. So game engines, if you're not familiar with them, are very fast, or designed to be very fast but approximate ways of creating and simulating interactive worlds. So that includes graphics, physics, maybe modeling other agents, anything needed to immerse a player, like this is from one of the Zelda games, to immerse a player in perhaps a strange and also still oddly familiar world. So this is a world where there are various kinds of magic spells and physics challenges you can see the player solving. They're trying to solve a physical problem, kind of like the kid with the shovel, but in this, to get their Easter egg. But in this case, they have to like teleport and throw this thing and it magically sticks to these things. And it's sort of a weird variation on physics. It's not physically plausible. And yet you can get it right away. You can see it. And the software enables this very interactive and flexible kind of physical problem solving. Okay. There's many other examples of ways that these game-style physics engines, which don't model physics necessarily the way a physicist would, although they draw on physics, but they make all sorts of approximations and hacks in order to try to handle a wide range of physical scenarios very efficiently. The physics engines don't have to be right, they just have to look good or look good enough over short timescales. And in that sense, they also match many of the performance characteristics we think that the brain cares about. Okay. I should say this slide and these images here are slightly modified from a slide from Tomer Ullman, another one of your distinguished Harvard colleagues. And if you want an introduction to this idea, check out Tomer's paper called Mind Games, which was a Trends in Cognitive Science paper from a few years ago, which is probably one of the best introductions to this idea. If you want to see a written form of it. This is another Ullman, who is just an illustration of what we might mean by when we talk about the game engine in the head. We don't mean a simulator that's a training ground for some machine learning algorithm, which is also a possible way and a way that game engines have been used a lot in AI, but rather a way to capture in engineering terms what's going on inside this kid's head when he thinks about, when he imagines in this situation, seeing the blocks and the bird on there, much like the situation we thought we were sort of putting GPT in before. But here he imagines, is it stable or not? Or what would happen if, for example, I rolled this ball, and mentally simulates the collisions and the effect and thinks, well, do I want that or do I not want that? Okay. So that's the way this kind of engineering framework can be used to capture some aspects of early common sense world modeling. But where it really becomes a framework for intelligence in the sense of making good guesses and bets or doing things that maximize expected utility, well, you have to be probabilistic, and not just probabilistic. The other key technical idea in the research program that we work on is what's called probabilistic programs. And this is a toolkit that, kind of like neural networks, this is a catch-all phrase for a set of ideas that have evolved over a number of years, even decades, that you can think of as combining the best features from an engineering standpoint of multiple paradigms for understanding intelligence computationally. So that includes the idea of doing probabilistic or Bayesian inference, working backwards to infer the likely causes that explain observed effects, for example, but also symbolic programs. So doing probabilistic inference on, for example, the inputs to programs from the outputs. That's important because if you want to capture something like intuitive physics, it's not enough to just say, well, there's some high-dimensional Gaussian, or maybe there's some weakly nonlinear thing. Rather, you want to take something like a physics engine simulator and use it as the heart of your probabilistic model. It's describing the causal processes in the world. And so you want to be able to do probabilistic inferences about what's likely to happen if I do this, or when I see that, what was probably the input? How heavy was this thing? Or what forces were applied? And modern probabilistic programming languages also integrate neural networks. So while I'm arguing that what we call neural networks, namely the computational abstraction in artificial neural networks that tries to scale up what a single neuron or a simple network of neurons might do, I'm arguing that is not our best engineering way to understand where human intelligence comes from. It's a valuable one. And the idea of differentiable systems and vectors for distributed representation, associative memory, for example, that's a very powerful idea. And modern probabilistic programming languages let you combine all three of these motifs, and that's very powerful. So just a few examples of how we have used this to capture some of the common sense intelligence that is there before language, and then I'll show you a little bit how language might build on it. So with Tomer and also a number of other colleagues, we've built these models which we sort of have sometimes lumped under the phrase the intuitive physics engine, which takes the physics engine part of game engines, wraps it inside a framework for probabilistic inference and approximate simulation, and uses that to model many kinds of common sense judgments that a person can make, for example, about these block tower scenes. So not surprising why I'd be interested in some of those tower stack building things that people are exploring with language models, okay? So given, for example, these stacks on the left, you might ask, how stable is the tower? How likely is a tower to fall? Or if it falls, which way will it fall? Or how far will the blocks fall? Or what happens if some of the blocks are colored differently and the different colors are heavier or lighter? So for example, you can see here that if I tell you that the gray blocks are 10 times heavier than the green blocks, you'll make a different prediction for which way they will fall if they fall on the top versus on the left. The geometries of the blocks are the same. I've just recolored them. But yet your mind's physics engine or your whatever mental physics simulator you have will make a different prediction, showing that it's both sensitive to mass, but also that I can kind of program it by just telling you something, like the gray stuff is 10 times heavier than the green stuff. Okay. Or if you see these surprisingly stable scenes, can you infer what is likely to be much heavier than another to explain why they're not falling over? So in each of these cases, we can make quantitatively predictive models based on this idea. I'm not going to go through the details, although I'll show you one example of a simulator glimpse in a second. But the idea of the kinds of experiments we do are we give people a number of different stimuli controlling certain sources of variation, like how complex is the stack or how unstable it might be in different ways, controlling for other sorts of confounds, and then we measure, for example, by asking people on a scale of 1 to 7, or by having them make a 2 alternative forced choice and just aggregating a bunch of people, or we can look at their reaction times. There's many ways to measure graded intuitions about stability. And on the y-axis here, I'm plotting the average stability judgments of a group of participants for 50 or 60 of these different block towers. On the x-axis, what I'm plotting is a model prediction, which is the average of the results of a small number of simulations in one of these approximate game-style physics things, where the system, part of the probabilistic simulator here is that we have uncertainty about a number of things in the scene that the visual stimulus does not completely determine. So we don't know exactly where the blocks are. We can't perfectly solve the inverse graphics problem from just a single image. We don't exactly know the coefficients of friction. We allow for the possibility that maybe there could be a force perturbation, a little burst of wind, or somebody could bump the table. Under various sources of uncertainty like that, and that's really important, we can infer that some stacks are likely to be more or less stable, have more or fewer blocks, or maybe no blocks fall over. And there's a very nice correlation, in this case, between the model predictions on the x-axis and human judgments on the y-axis. The same thing extends to a much, in some sense, stranger sort of task, where, like a lot of other experiments in psychology, we study the mind effectively by giving you something that you don't have much experience with, if we're trying to understand what do you do that you didn't just learn in a very simple way. So the question of will this stack of blocks fall over is one that many of us have a fair amount of experience with. If you play games like Jenga, you have a lot of experience. But I can show you a similar scene, like these tables with red and yellow blocks, and ask you a question which, if you haven't seen me talk about this before, you probably never thought about. What if you bump one of these tables hard enough to knock some of the blocks onto the floor? Is it more likely to be red or yellow blocks on the floor? And people can, again, make a graded judgment. That's what you see on the y-axis. And the model can make a graded judgment, too. And the model is almost as predictive of this very strange question as it is predictive of the much more familiar task of judging just how likely is it to fall. Okay. Now, how does that work? Well, it works because, again, our system isn't training on data. Rather, it's built a model and it's doing a simulation. And it does just a small number of very coarse and probabilistic simulations. So what do I mean by that? I'll be more concrete now. This is a window into one of those simulations applied to one of those scenes. And you can see here, I've modeled a small bump of the table. Here, on the same configuration, I've modeled a bigger bump. Okay. The simulator probabilistically tries out bumps of a few different sizes and a few different angles, kind of semi-randomly. And by aggregating the results of just a few simulations, you can get a pretty reasonable sense to answer the question. You also don't have to run the simulations very long, right? You can see that after just the first couple of time steps, you already know the answer, at least for many of the scenes, or you may be uncertain. So we only have to run a small number of simulations for just a small number of time steps, and we could also run them at low resolution. And that's enough to capture what's going on there. Okay. So that's at least some window into how we use these tools to model the guesses and the bets that your brain makes. We can do similar kinds of things in dynamics tasks. Like, for example, this is work from Kevin Smith and colleagues, where you have to predict, oh, I kind of messed it up by going too fast. You have to predict whether it's going to hit, this billiard ball bouncing around is going to hit the red or the green surface first. So we can make this a little interactive here. So say ooh if you think it's going to hit red or green, or ah if you're going to think it's going to hit green. Okay, here we go. But better go fast because it's about to hit the red. Ooh. Okay, if I hadn't messed it up, you would have said ooh and then ah, but I messed it up. But you can simulate that too. Okay, and notice that when it's first starting, right? It looks like most people are pretty sure it's probably going to brush the red, and then it just barely misses it. It takes you a little while before you become confident about, it's usually only about there, before you become confident that it's going to hit the green. So people are able to simulate, but usually only about 1 or 2 bounces at most in open things like this. And we can capture that by assuming that they do a sort of dynamic version of what we were showing, again, with some noise or uncertainty in the trajectory of the ball and its position and velocity, and especially uncertainty about bounces, because people can, unless you're a really experienced billiards player, you're pretty uncertain about how to extrapolate bounces. Okay, and that model, this is just showing that cone of uncertainty that comes from running these probabilistic simulation. It's able, if we just add up the results of a few of these simulations, it's able to capture the tendency that people tend to say that's probably red, then I'm not sure, then it's probably green. More quantitatively in this study, we had 100 different scenes. I'm showing you 4 of them here, and I'm showing you dynamic trajectories, the plot first on top people and on the bottom model, and showing how the graded confidence changes over the scene. And you can see quite a lot of interesting structure to the data Some scenes, people are very confident of one, and then they switch to the other. Sometimes they're just not sure for a long while, and then there's a sudden resolution. Sometimes there's multiple switches, and it's really striking how much this model is able to capture it. In work that I was very privileged to collaborate on with Ed Vool, who was long ago in my lab, he's now at UCSD and Amazon, we worked with infant researchers Anno Teglis and Luca Bonatti and others to study intuitive physics in infants. So 12-month-olds were asked to extrapolate, were shown scenes like these little gumball lottery machines here. And they saw the objects bouncing around for a little while, and then there was a period of occlusion, and one of the objects appeared. And what was varied across different conditions of the experiment was whether there was more or less objects of 3 or 1 of the color that ultimately appeared, where those objects were at the time of occlusion, and how long the time of occlusion was. And a very simple probabilistic physics simulation model is able to make different predictions as a function of those variables. And it captures in a graded and fairly compelling quantitative way, given the very strong limitations of how hard it is to get quantitative behavioral data from infants. But it captures infants' uncertain predictions in the sense that the classic method that Spelke and many others have pioneered for studying the infant mind is looking at violation of expectation or other looking time measures. People, and babies too, look longer when you show them things that are surprising. And looking time here is predicted in a quantitative way by inverse probability in one of these physics models. In even some of the most recent work, this is in our lab from Sam Chayette and Tracy Mills and Sam Chayette. We can study how people are able to predict in just a simple sequence of a moving dot, something that goes well beyond physics, but can have much more structure, almost various kinds of algorithmic or program structure. So just the ability to predict what's coming next is really quite a powerful way to study the mind's models and how we use them to make guesses and bets in the world. These are things that are distinctive to humans, as Sam and others have shown working with macaque monkeys, and developed significantly from childhood to adulthood, although human children appear, at least so far, to look a lot more like adults than like macaques. In work I mentioned before from Kelsey Allen and Kevin Smith and colleagues, or I alluded to when I showed you the kid with the shovel, for reasons of time, I'll basically skip this, but I'll just refer you to their PNAS and forthcoming paper. But to study how people use tools and use their intuitive physics flexibly for tools, Kelsey and Kevin came up with this cool video game, which we called the virtual tools game. And you can see all you do in this game is your goal is always to get the red object into the green place, the green location, stably. And you act by choosing an object, a tool, and just dropping it into the scene. And then physics unfolds and you see what happens. Okay. People really like playing this game. You can actually play it yourself at the MIT Museum. It's part of their new AI exhibit in the new MIT Museum in Kendall Square. And like a lot of other kinds of physical problem solving, but very much unlike what's often called reinforcement learning and machine learning, this is a kind of a reinforcement learning task. You just act and you get some feedback, and then you can act again. So you learn from trial and error. But across many different levels of this game, people learn extremely quickly. They learn in, sometimes just 2 or 3 trials, rarely more than 5 or 10. And we model that by basically putting that simulator in the loop and having a process which imagines possible ways of solving the problem, drawing from just a very simple prior to try to cause collisions or object interactions, imagines what might happen. If you come up with a simulation with a few tries in your head that is likely to solve the problem in the world, then you try it out. Otherwise, you sort of repeat and resample a different part of the space. And that's able to capture people's learning curves quite precisely. So these are across 20 different levels in the physics game. The red and the blue curves. The blue curve shows humans' cumulative probability of success as a function of trials, and the red curve shows the model. So the model, this idea of just trying out a few ideas in your head, and then when one of them seems to work, try it in the real world, and if that fails, repeat, captures both the problems that people find harder or easier, both their ultimate level of success, sometimes people don't always solve it, but also the relative rate of learning, how many trials it takes you to figure it out. Okay. Mostly that's all I'm going to say about intuitive physics, and it's mostly all I'm going to say about common sense. I want to save the last few minutes to talk about language. I'll just point to a whole other line of work, which was done in part in collaboration with Rebecca Sachs here, one of my great friends and MIT colleagues, along with a number of others, folks like Julian Hara-Edinger, who was a grad student with me and Laura Schultz, and Laura also at MIT played a role in a lot of these things. If you want a summary of this sort of parallel research program of using the idea of probabilistic inference on top of programs that capture the causal structure of the physical world, and in this case, how social agents interact with it, check out another really nice Trends in Cognitive Science piece by Julian Haredinger and colleagues called The Naive Utility Calculus. This was published back in 2016. Julian, I should say, by the way, is now a faculty member at Yale in psychology. And basically, I'll just point you to this. It's some of my favorite work that I've been involved in. But what we are doing here is we are also using the idea of programs, but to describe the world. But now it's programs which take as input percepts and goals and plan actions. So these are models. They also do effectively kind of rational decision making. Goals are sources of reward for an agent, and actions have costs. And in this work, the idea is that we are modeling agents as making plans, sequences of actions to maximize their expected utility, choose actions that support their goals, and so on, given their beliefs about the world. But the key is that these are not models of human agents. These are models of human agents, models of human agents, or perhaps non-human agents too. Like, for example, in the work of Kylie Hamlin and others with the little balls, or the classic work of Hyder and Simmel or Gergely and Chibra, if you know all these really beautiful studies going back many years of studying how human adults and even babies can make sense of little shapes moving around if they follow effectively the principles of efficient action planning. Okay, so in this line of research, what we study is with similar kinds of stimuli, for example, in the food truck stimuli, which Chris Baker and Julian did with Rebecca and me, looking at an agent moving around in the world, in this case, looking for one of several food trucks which park on campus in one of those 2 yellow parking spots. Could be the Korean truck or the Lebanese truck or the Mexican truck, park in different spots on different days. But when an agent comes out, goes around the building where they see the Lebanese truck and turns back to the Korean truck, and you ask, what is that agent's favorite food? Korean, Lebanese, or Mexican? People infer that actually it's Mexican. That's the bar on the right under desires, the M. Mexican was her favorite, right? Even though that's not the one that was actually present at all in the scene. But the best way to explain why she moved on an efficient path, not to her actual goal, but to what she thought might have been there. We also ask people what were the agent's initial beliefs, and they say, as our model predicts, that she probably thought Mexican was there, so that was her initial belief, and that's what she wanted. But that's why she went to the other side to look. But the reason she went back is because, well, it wasn't there. She only discovered that when she got there. So this, for example, across many different stimuli, again, where we vary in a controlled way the different sort of stimuli, is able to quantitatively predict people's inferences about agents' desires and beliefs, and also how they interact. Because in scenes like this one, you can only make sense of her action if you posit a goal that is not present and the false initial belief that it was likely to have been present. So these are just, again, a taste of how this toolkit of, in this case, sort of doubly Bayesian or approximate rational probabilistic inferences about agents, inferences about other approximately rational agents, is able to capture core aspects of our common sense world models. Now, how does language come into this? Well, again, I don't really have very much time. In fact, I think I'm out of time. But I owe it to both the beginning of my talk, and I hope if you'll give me just another 5-6 minutes to just basically advertise this very nice paper by 2 of the students that I started with when I mentioned the original acknowledgements. Well, it's actually by a number of people, but the co-first authors are Leo Wong and Gabe Grand, and Alex Lev also played a really key role in this work, along with some of my faculty colleagues like Jacob Andreas and Vikash Mansinga and Noah Goodman. But what you can see in this paper, and this paper expresses, when we were working on this paper, which you can find on arXiv, it's currently undergoing revision for a couple of different publication targets. It's very long and it's being broken into pieces, but you can, I urge you to check out at least the first part and read more of it if you like. When we were working on this paper, we called it the white paper, because it's a roadmap for a research program. It's not a set of research results, but it tries to show you the path for connecting modern language models and the ways in which capturing statistics of language can build on and amplify and extend and really become much more powerful when you ground them in the kinds of common sense knowledge that I was just showing you via these mechanisms of probabilistic programs. So in the paper, the idea is to consider all the many ways that we use language to inform and structure our thinking, whether it's in intuitive physics or intuitive psychology or other sorts of domains. And also all the ways that language can extend our thinking, the ways we can learn new concepts, either explicitly by having people explain things to us, or implicitly by seeing how people use language and certain patterns and sentences, and even build up whole new intuitive theories that mostly come to us from people telling us things. We're trying to explain, how can you do that? And how can we use this in some sense to make sense of what are the current kinds of intelligence that we see in large language models and what's missing, and what's a more human-like way forward. And the key idea in the paper is to combine two things. One is this idea of what we've called the probabilistic language of thought. So this is a paper from the recent concepts book, well, from 10 years ago, recent compared to the older concepts book by Lawrence and Margolis, but the new concepts book that Noah Goodman, Toby Gerstenberg, and I wrote, which sort of explains how we can use a probabilistic programming language. If you want to learn more about these probabilistic programming languages as reflected in that chapter, you could check out the probmods.org webbook, which is just shown here. This is an example of the probabilistic programming language Church. But what we show in this webbook is how you can use this single programming language. It's kind of a version of Lisp, but in ways that we use Lisp to capture the structured probabilistic models, like for intuitive physics or intuitive psychology and so on. And we have a single probabilistic programming language which can capture basically all the cognitive models that you've seen, all these kinds of frameworks for guessing and betting, or making rational expected utility proximate inferences, okay? And suggest that can provide a unifying substrate for all these common sense models. And you combine that with the idea that we can see in recent large language models, which is that they aren't just models of natural language, they're also trained on code, source code, in many different programming languages. And source code, as is often pointed out, but is, I think, not fully appreciated. Source code, right, is programming languages or programs that are designed to be read and written by humans and not just machine executable or read by machines. So while people often point out that programming languages are very different from natural languages, source code, whether it's languages like Python or JavaScript or Lisp, is often written in a way that is still rather language-like, somewhat in its syntax in terms of like hierarchical phrase structure, but also especially in terms of the way we name variables or name functions, as well as, of course, comment code. So in a sense, you could say the idea of this paper is a sort of source code as a metaphor as the language of thought, which mixes together natural language and programs in a probabilistic programming language. And the paper shows how you can use actually, effectively a kind of what is not even a state-of-the-art language model, but an early code LLM, as it's called, the OpenAI's Codex model, to basically define a probabilistic translation mapping from and to, but mostly in this paper, from natural language to one of these probabilistic programming languages, Church in this case, and then applies it to just a number of different domains. I'll just show you one application just to close the loop back to intuitive physics. But for example, if you remember this, right? So as I was saying here, we use natural language to give queries and to describe kinds of intuitive physical reasoning that maybe you haven't done before. So we can basically now make an end-to-end model of language-conditioned, language-informed intuitive physics by taking, in this case, a 2D physics engine that can capture the tabletop physics that I showed you before, and use a code LLM to just capture the idea that effectively that we can think about contextual meaning in language as a translation from a description of a world, like a tabletop scene that says there's one tall stack of red blocks and there are two short stacks of yellow blocks. And the question again is, if I bump the table hard enough to knock some of them on the floor, will it be more red or yellow blocks? So the model is able to translate that into this internal code and run a simulation like this. This is not seen, this is imagined. So this is a view into the mental simulation that the model runs given that language. Or we can describe a more complex scene, and we can describe it, and then we can imagine corresponding more complex physical scenes and simulate what happens there. But basically, it's just a modular composition of the same things. A language system, putatively like the one in the human brain, that translates from what we say and hear into some mental language, which configures the brain's physics engine in this case, runs a small number of these probabilistic simulations. And that alone is, or well, alone or together, is enough to give a quantitatively predictive model, much like, not quite, but almost as with the same quantitative predictive power as you saw before when we were just setting up the model for itself. So this is just a taste of some of the work that I think is, or that is ongoing by the students I mentioned and a number of others. I should say, by the way, this particular paper here was done with Leo and Gabe, but the experimental and modeling studies were done with Said Zhang, who's shown up there, who's also a student at MIT. And we and others are pursuing analogous studies like in a theory of mind and social cognition domains. And I just say mostly stay tuned. And the last bit is to say, because I can't help but say this just a little bit towards where we're going, right? Is I do think that there's a long history in cognitive science and all the related fields, linguistics, philosophy, certainly AI, of asking what is meaning, right? What does it mean to understand language, and what is a thought that's conveyed in language? And in the engineering sketch I'm showing you, there's a step towards what's actually a theory of meaning. I mean, if I venture to say that, it's just a step, and there's a lot to be filled in. But an idea that, again, has a long history in different ways, but I think now we're in a position to capture it in an engineering sense, which is to think of meaning not in abstract form, but contextualized meaning. Like, what does a piece of language mean in context? A word, a phrase, a sentence, in the context of the rest of the sentences, or the other sentences that have come before, or the other ways you will build up a model of the current situation, like your perceptual system. But something like a joint distribution between natural language and code, but in a probabilistic programming language of thought. It's that joint distribution, which is the key object that you can capture in these code LLMs combined with probabilistic inference. And you put those pieces together, and you have at least some of the building blocks needed to unify what are traditionally a number of different takes on meaning in all these fields. So the idea that what is meaning, is it something like informal semantics, like compositional logical construction of thought? Is it something like distributional word embeddings? That's, again, not just a modern LLM idea, but a very old idea in psychology, as well as natural language processing. Those are two interesting views. Two others, like meaning is about grounding in the world and the embodiment thesis, or meaning is about pragmatics and context. Well, in a sense, the probabilistic programming and probabilistic language of thought stuff I showed you kind of gives you the more compositional and grounded aspects of meaning. The code LLM view gives you the distributional statistical aspects of it, and at least some approximations to the pragmatic or contextual aspects of meaning. And you put these things together, and it's building blocks for how we can really think about what language is really about, and language use, and how language builds on and then very much amplifies and extends our thinking. So many open questions, and I'll just end with some conclusions. What is thinking? It's not just a mystery, although we are still far from capturing thinking in all its forms computationally. But the fundamental idea that intelligence is about making good guesses and good bets, something that is fundamentally also about the model that our minds have of the world and ourselves in it, and then using that in a rational way to guide what we do next and what we think about next. Okay. This is something that we are starting to have tools to be able to capture. And this gives us a way, especially when language comes into the picture, to really understand what it is we're all here for, right? It's about not just knowledge, but understanding. It's about the deep and broad systems that we build individually and collectively, that we build through our own experience and through language, to sustain and grow knowledge in an ever-changing world, and a world that we're changing. So the tools that I've shown you are part of what I think are the building blocks to actually try to understand this. On the technical side, there's what you could call this neural symbolic probabilistic synthesis that modern probabilistic programming languages and various kinds of neural networks and language models can bring together. But we're still very much at the beginning of trying to put all of these things together. So if you're interested in this, if any of this excites or inspires you, that's my goal here. And I hope you'll consider, whether it's collaboratively with us in your own work, or in whatever way really most inspires you to think about how to build this kind of intelligence, either on the science side or on the engineering side, but especially to people interested in AI. I think this is necessary. unless we want to completely offload the AI future to a small number of very well-resourced companies and individuals, if we want to see a future for artificial intelligence that is one that is more open and democratic, that is one that is more grounded in and informing science, I think we need tools and a mindset in order to do it. I think there's too much at stake. So join us. Thank you.